So I'm really happy here to have a look at for the first time my print copy of The Last Dance of Lola Montez, which is my second Call of Cthulhu Adventure. And me being me and me being a historian based here in Ballarat, it's one of those areas where I like to mix together local history and quirky and strange stories from the past into the Cthulhu mythos. And in particular, talking about a character that is iconic in Ballarat history, Lola Montez, born Marie Gilbert. And she was an Irish dancer, actor, and celebrity who performed and lived under a Spanish persona, Lola Montez. And she's a character about whom there are very vivid and quite sensationalist depictions. You know, this one here from the Sydney Mail describing her as, at that period, her figure was even more attractive than her face, lovely as the latter was, lithe and graceful as a young fawn. Every movement that she made seemed instinctual with melody as she prepared to commence the dance, and her dark eyes were blazing and flashing with excitement. And she's a unique character, a celebrity that was involved very closely with King Ludwig I of Bavaria and nearly brought down the government there. In Ballarat, when she came here after Europe became a bit hot to hold her, she performed her sensational spider dance, which caused miners to be in such a flurry that they threw pieces of gold nuggets and so on the stage as she danced. And in Ballarat, she came into conflict with a fellow by the name of Henry Seacamp, who was the editor of the Ballarat Times. And their disputes reached such a point that there were a number of violent encounters involving Lola very famously using a whip to attack him. But that particular brawl at the United States Hotel ended up with spiked clubs and even drawn revolvers before others intervened. One of Henry Seacamp's supporters and a woman who was outraged by Lola's supposed licentious dancing actually assaulted her at one point and put her into medical care for a month, given the violence of the attack. So, she's a really unique character which inflames strong passions. And the other thing I wanted to explore with this story was something that had often occurred to me in vampire literature and the works of people like Anne Rice and Vampire the Masquerade and, in the True Blood series and so on. The way in which these characters from the past become disconnected from their humanity, the way in which, as the time rolled on, the things that made life worth living would gradually fade and disappear from view, and you're kind of left alone and disconnected from all those things that made you feel human, loss of your humanity, the beast as they often call it. And I started to think about, when we see these stories, it's almost always from, the vampire's perspective as a protagonist. And I started to think about the way in which when you read that sort of literature, these characters are so enormously destructive. The narrative is so incredibly narcissistic. It's all about this tragic figure and the way in which they exploit and manipulate their environment and often do quite atrocious things without even thinking about it and not even necessarily out of malevolence. So in my story, we have both a critique of the vampire narrative, the way in which people lose connection, the way in which humans become almost like the way we think of pets, these things that pass through our lives as we drift on for eternity, and the enormous destruction that can be wrought in that kind of narrative, as well as exploring a lesser-known part of Ballarat history, as is typical in my literature, and I really love the way they've illustrated this work. We have many great materials. We have excerpts from the newspapers of the day, and as is the way I write, I like using the actual historical record and putting my narrative in and around the material from the period. So we have a fictional narrative, a historical fiction, yet one which is closely linked to the actual historical narrative of the day. And once again, I love the period illustrations. And what I've done for this is taken historical out of copyright images and stories and newspaper articles to construct them into my narrative. I've also taken advantage of a local amazing resource, the Ballarat Mechanics Institute, which contains an enormous library of works collected in the 19th century, including, and this is something else that inspired my story here, actual books on vampirism and how to deal with vampires and supernatural threats in your community, something that was recruited by the spiritualist movement in Ballarat that was very prominent at the time. And so through these, I've constructed, it's quite a dark narrative. It's a bit darker than William Bailey's Haunted Mansion, and it's one where we have people that are united by grief and the torments that have been inflicted on them almost without thinking through the impact of this vampire in the community that's slowly sending its tendrils through to absorb and take over, but one that's also, in a sense, a tragic figure. As I say here in my blurb, there's 5 friends united by grief who face torments driven by a dark threat, one they thought hidden for over a century. A threat driven by a dark thirst for passion, soaked in blood. And this, in a sense, vicarious feeding of other people's trauma led me to another aspect I wanted to explore in this story, which is today, the way celebrity works today, with people being sort of, in a sense, disconnected from humanity, people being, in a sense, lost through that process, and people who vicariously feed on the trauma of others, such as modern-day influencers and people who are, manipulative politicians and so on, that, in a sense, manufacture and create anxiety and outrage and other people's dramas as a way of feeling connected, but also drawing public attention and notoriety for their works. So I've explored a few themes here in this story, and one thing I should mention too, if you are from Western Victoria, there are an awful lot of Ballarat Easter eggs in here, places, people, and other references you might be aware of. Though, of course, I've changed all the names and so on, so it's something else you might enjoy. Anyway, I'm really happy with how this has come out. It's a fantastic one. I should note it's a story which often has provoked strong emotional responses in the people who've played the game, and ones they've really enjoyed, because in a sense it is about the way in which narcissistic creatures like the vampire, like perhaps the emotional vampires in some ways referencing with regards to influences and so on, live off that, provoking those strong emotional responses. So I've put in some trigger warnings here regarding some of those connections. But I think it's one that you'll really enjoy, and one that when we've done test plays, people have really enjoyed going through, and one that's led to quite a lot of thoughtful response and discussion in the aftermath of the adventure. So I really hope you enjoy this, and I will look forward to seeing your feedback. Thank you.